I never thought I'd be the type of person to check my wife's phone, but desperation makes you do things you never imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I discovered that our joint savings account, the one we'd been building for 5 years to buy our dream home, had been drained to just $347. The same account that had $23,000 just 2 weeks earlier. My hands trembled as I stared at the bank statement on my laptop screen. Transaction after transaction showed withdrawals I didn't recognize. Expensive restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels in the city during times when Sarah claimed she was working late. A jewelry store purchase for $1,200 that I certainly didn't make. And then the big one, a $8,000 transfer to an account I'd never seen before. Sarah was in the shower, humming some tune I didn't recognize. The same woman who used to lecture me about spending $12 on coffee with friends was somehow hemorrhaging our life savings without batting an eye. I felt like I was looking at a stranger's financial records, not my wife's. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the realization that she'd been lying to my face for months. Every time I'd mentioned our house fund, she'd smile and talk about how close we were getting to our goal. She'd even suggested we start looking at real estate listings just last weekend. The audacity of it all made my stomach turn. I heard the shower turn off and quickly closed the laptop. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just discovered. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand explanations and answers. But another part of me, the part that had learned to be strategic during my years in business, told me to wait. To observe. To understand the full scope of what was happening before I made any moves. When Sarah walked into the kitchen wrapped in her bathrobe, hair still damp, she looked exactly like the woman I'd married 6 years ago. Same warm smile, same way of reaching for the coffee pot with one hand while checking her phone with the other. But now I was seeing her through completely different eyes. "Morning, honey," she said, kissing my cheek like she had every morning for years. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, which was partially true. I'd been tossing and turning all night, though I hadn't known why until this moment. "Just checking some work emails." She nodded absently, already absorbed in whatever was on her phone screen. I watched her fingers move across the keyboard, typing rapidly. Who was she texting at 7 a.m.? The same person who had been receiving our money? That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the fool who confronted his cheating wife empty-handed. I wasn't going to be the victim who discovered the betrayal only after it was too late to protect himself. If Sarah could play games with our finances, then I could play games too. But my game was going to be different. My game was going to be about survival, about securing my future, about making sure that when this house of cards came tumbling down, I wouldn't be buried in the rubble. The next few weeks were the most challenging acting performance of my life. Every morning, I'd wake up next to Sarah and pretend everything was normal. I'd make coffee, we'd discuss our days, and I'd kiss her goodbye as she left for work. But underneath this facade of normalcy, I was executing a plan that would protect me from the financial devastation she was orchestrating. My first move was research. I spent hours at the library, somewhere Sarah would never think to look for me, researching divorce laws, asset protection, and financial planning. I learned about hidden assets, about the importance of documentation, and about how to legally protect myself without technically breaking any laws. The information was sobering but empowering. I also hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but I needed concrete evidence of what Sarah was doing. Within a week, I had photographs of her entering hotels with a man I didn't recognize. Credit card receipts from restaurants where she'd been wine and dining her lover while I ate leftover takeout at home. The investigator even managed to identify the man, David Chen, a divorced real estate developer who apparently had expensive taste and no moral compass. But the most important thing I did was open my own secret savings account. I called it my insurance policy. Every week, I'd transfer a small amount from my personal checking account, money from freelance work Sarah didn't know about, cash back from business expenses, even coins I'd collect from the couch cushions. It seemed insignificant at first, maybe $50 or $100 per week, but it was growing. I also started documenting everything. I kept detailed records of every conversation we had about money, every lie she told about working late, every inconsistency in her stories. I took photos of bank statements, made copies of important documents, and even started recording some of our conversations on my phone. I felt like a spy in my own home, but I knew this information would be crucial later. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be growing bolder. She'd started staying out later, claiming she was working on a big project that required evening meetings. She'd bought new clothes, expensive ones, and when I asked about them, she'd say they were necessary for her professional image. She'd even started going to the gym more often, though I suspected she was meeting David there. The hardest part was watching her lie to my face about our finances. She'd still bring up the house fund, still talk about our future together, still make plans for vacations we'd never be able to afford. One evening, she even suggested we start looking at more expensive neighborhoods, claiming she'd gotten a raise at work that she was keeping as a surprise until her next review period. I played along, nodding and smiling and pretending to be excited about these fictional plans. But inside, I was calculating. I was planning. I was preparing for the day when I'd reveal that I knew everything, and that, unlike her, I'd been smart enough to protect myself. The secret account was growing faster than I'd expected. Between the freelance work and some smart investments I'd made without telling Sarah, I'd managed to accumulate almost $3,000 in just 6 weeks. It wasn't much compared to what she'd stolen, but it was a start. More importantly, it was mine, and she had no idea it existed. By the 4th month of my secret investigation, Sarah's behavior had become so reckless that I almost felt sorry for her. She was living in a fantasy world, believing she could maintain 2 relationships indefinitely without consequences. But reality was about to come crashing down on both of us in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first crack in her facade came when she forgot to log out of her email on our shared computer. I wasn't even snooping, I was trying to print a work document when I saw the notification pop up. David had sent her a message with the subject line, "Can't wait for Cabo next week." My blood ran cold. Cabo. She'd told me she was going to a work conference in Denver. I clicked on the email and discovered an entire romantic correspondence that made my stomach churn. They'd been planning this trip for months, booking expensive resorts and first-class flights using money that should have been going toward our future home. The emails were filled with intimate details about their relationship and casual mentions of the boring husband, who was too clueless to notice anything. That night, I confronted her about the trip. "How's the conference planning going?" I asked casually over dinner. "Oh, it's going great," she replied without missing a beat. "Really looking forward to the networking opportunities in Denver. Might even extend it an extra day if the sessions are valuable." I nodded and smiled, but inside I was documenting every word. The ease with which she lied to me was perhaps more hurtful than the actual betrayal. This wasn't a woman who was conflicted about her choices, this was someone who had made peace with deceiving me completely. My secret account had grown to nearly $8,000 by this point. I'd been more aggressive about transferring money, even taking on additional freelance projects that Sarah didn't know about. I'd also started moving some of our joint assets into accounts she couldn't access. Technically, everything I was doing was legal. I was simply protecting marital assets from being squandered. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Sarah's trip to Cabo was scheduled for the following week, and I'd planned to use that time to consult with a divorce attorney. Instead, I got a call from my private investigator with news that changed everything. "Your wife's boyfriend is married," he told me over the phone. "Not just married, he's going through a messy divorce of his own. And according to my sources, he's been using your wife's money to pay his legal fees." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Sarah wasn't just betraying me, she was being used by someone who was betraying his own wife. Our life savings wasn't funding a romantic affair, it was funding David's divorce attorney. Sarah was just another victim in his scheme, except she was victimizing me in the process. I felt a complex mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, but also a strange kind of pity for Sarah. She thought she was living some grand romance, but she was actually being manipulated by a man who was using her financially just as much as she was using me emotionally. That evening, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I wasn't going to wait for her to return from her fake conference. I wasn't going to let her continue living in this fantasy world where she could have everything she wanted without consequences. It was time to act. But my plan wasn't just about confrontation, it was about protection. I'd learned enough about David's situation to know that when his house of cards collapsed, it was going to take Sarah down with him. And I wasn't going to let her drag me down too. The morning Sarah left for her work conference, I kissed her goodbye and wished her luck with her presentations. She was practically glowing with excitement, probably thinking about the romantic getaway she'd planned with David. I watched her pull out of our driveway in the car we'd bought together, using money from the account she'd been systematically draining, and I felt a strange sense of relief. The performance was almost over. What Sarah didn't know was that I'd been busy during the weeks leading up to her trip. My secret account had grown to $12,000, but more importantly, I'd been working with a forensic accountant to trace exactly where our money had gone. The paper trail was devastating. Not only had Sarah given David access to our joint account, but she'd also been co-signing loans for his business ventures. We were liable for almost $35,000 in debt I'd never agreed to. I'd also discovered that David had been lying to Sarah about his divorce proceedings. He wasn't just going through a divorce, he was facing fraud charges related to his business. The man my wife was in love with was essentially a criminal who was using her as a financial lifeline while his own world crumbled around him. On the second day of Sarah's trip, I received the phone call I'd been expecting. It was from David's wife, Elena, who had gotten my number from the private investigator I'd hired. She was crying when she called. "I'm so sorry," she said through tears. "I just found out about your wife. I had no idea David was seeing someone else, let alone using her money to pay his legal bills." We agreed to meet for coffee, and what I learned from Elena made my blood run cold. David had been running the same scam on multiple women for over a year. Sarah wasn't his only victim, she was just the most recent one. He'd convinced at least 3 other women to invest in his business or help him through his difficult divorce, and he'd disappeared with their money once he'd gotten what he needed. Elena showed me bank records, text messages, and emails that painted a picture of a man who was not just unfaithful, but genuinely dangerous. He'd been using Sarah's money to fund a lifestyle that included gambling debts, expensive cars, and legal fees for charges that went far beyond divorce proceedings. "The FBI is investigating him," Elena told me. "They think he's been involved in money laundering through his development company. Anyone who's been giving him money could be considered an accessory if they can't prove they didn't know what he was doing." My heart sank. Sarah wasn't just betraying me, she was potentially implicating both of us in federal crimes. Every dollar she'd transferred to David could be seen as participation in his money laundering scheme. The romantic affair I'd been documenting was actually a criminal conspiracy. I immediately called my lawyer, who confirmed my worst fears. If the FBI investigation found evidence that our joint account had been used to fund illegal activities, I could be charged as an accessory even if I hadn't known about it. The fact that Sarah had been using our money without my knowledge wouldn't necessarily protect me from prosecution. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I couldn't wait for Sarah to return from her trip. I couldn't confront her privately and hope she'd cooperate with authorities. I had to protect myself legally, financially, and personally before her actions destroyed both our lives. I called Elena and told her I was ready to cooperate with the FBI investigation. I turned over all the evidence I'd gathered about Sarah's financial activities, including the records of money transfers to David. I also provided documentation showing that I'd been unaware of these transactions and had been actively trying to protect our assets once I'd discovered them. The next morning, I filed for divorce and requested immediate separation of assets. I also filed a police report about the unauthorized use of our joint account, officially establishing that I was a victim of financial fraud rather than a participant in money laundering. My secret account, which had grown to $15,000, was now my only financial security. Everything else, our house, our cars, our joint accounts, was potentially going to be frozen as evidence in the federal investigation. Sarah returned from her conference on a Sunday evening, tanned and happy, with gifts she'd bought me in what she claimed was the Denver airport gift shop. The keychain had a cactus on it and said, Mexico, which would have been funny if the situation weren't so tragic. She had no idea that her entire world was about to implode. I let her unpack, let her tell me about her amazing networking opportunities and her productive meetings with potential clients. I listened to her describe the resort, conference center, and watched her show me photos she'd carefully curated to exclude any sign of David. She was still lying, still performing, still believing she could maintain this double life indefinitely. But Monday morning, reality arrived in the form of FBI agents at our door. I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face when she saw the badges. It was like watching someone wake up from a dream and realize they're in a nightmare. The color drained from her face, and she actually stumbled backward, grabbing the doorframe for support. Sarah Mitchell, one of the agents asked. We'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with David Chen and your financial transactions with his business accounts. The next few hours were a blur of questions, explanations, and devastating revelations. Sarah learned that David had been arrested in Mexico while they were together. He'd been using her money to fund not just his legal troubles, but also his attempts to flee the country. The romantic getaway she thought they were sharing was actually his escape plan, and she'd been funding it with our life savings. She also learned that I'd been cooperating with the investigation for weeks. When she looked at me with those betrayed eyes, I felt a moment of doubt about my choices. But then I remembered the months of lies, the stolen money, the casual way she'd been planning to destroy our future for a man who was using her just as much as she was using me. How could you do this to me? She asked, tears streaming down her face. I'm your wife. How could I do this to you? I replied. Sarah, you stole $23,000 from our joint account to fund a relationship with a criminal. You co-signed loans that put us both at risk for fraud charges. You've been lying to me for months while planning a future with someone else. How could you do this to us? The investigation revealed the full scope of David's scheme. He'd been using Sarah and at least 4 other women to launder money through his development company. The romantic emails, the expensive gifts, the promises of a future together, it was all part of a calculated plan to gain access to their finances. Sarah wasn't his lover, she was his victim. But she'd made me her victim in the process. My secret account, which had grown to $18,000 by this point, was the only money we had left that wasn't frozen as evidence. The house would have to be sold to pay legal fees. The cars would be repossessed. Our credit was destroyed. But I had something Sarah didn't, a plan for moving forward. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Sarah's lawyer tried to claim that I'd been hiding assets, but the timeline of my secret account clearly showed that I'd started protecting our money only after discovering her theft. The judge ruled that I'd acted reasonably to protect marital assets from being squandered. Sarah was ultimately charged with money laundering, though she eventually plea bargained down to a lesser charge by agreeing to testify against David. She served 6 months in minimum security prison and was ordered to pay restitution to the other victims of David's scheme. David, meanwhile, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The FBI discovered that his entire real estate development company had been a front for laundering money from various illegal activities. Sarah had been funding organized crime without even knowing it. 6 months after that terrible Sunday evening, I was living in a small apartment across town, working to rebuild my credit and my life. The secret account that had started as a desperate attempt to protect myself had become the foundation for a new beginning. I'd learned that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest, but I'd also learned that we have more power to protect ourselves than we realize. Sarah reached out to me once after her release from prison. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make things right between us. But there was nothing left to make right. The woman I'd married had made choices that revealed she was never really the person I thought she was. The marriage we'd built had been based on a foundation of lies that went deeper than I'd ever imagined. I wished her well and hung up the phone. My secret account had grown to $25,000, more than what we'd lost to David's scheme. I was finally ready to start looking at houses again, But this time, I was shopping for one person, not two. And this time, I was the only one who knew the account number.